Alice as Epic Hero by Camille Paglia, 1994. A mathematician and Anglican deacon who spent his entire adult life as a sheltered Fellow of Christ Church College at Oxford University. Dodgson belongs to the history of literature rather than mathematics because of his two masterpieces, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, 1865, and Through the Looking Glass, 1871, which were inspired by Alice Pleasance Little, young daughter of the Dean of Christ Church. The Alice books are the greatest examples of the crowded genre of Victorian children's literature, which sprang from the new romantic vision of the child. For Rousseau and Wordsworth, children have a primal innocence and purity. They are saintly and sexless ambassadors of nature, untouched by corrupt society. Throughout Victorian literature, including the classic novels of Charles Dickens, the orphaned girl child is the supreme symbol of profound emotion and beleaguered virtue. Carroll's Alice, one of the outstanding characters of world literature, is not an orphan, but in her stories she is mysteriously parentless. We hear of a sister, a nurse, and 3 cats, but the entire adult world has been obliterated. It exists as empty architectural spaces, as in Erie de Chirico paintings, a schoolroom or a drawing room with a stone mantel, clock face, and mirror, through which Alice steps into another dimension. The invisible hierarchical system of social and familial authority has been recreated instead in the Wonderland of the unconscious, or fascinating, baffling dream life that Carroll, before Freud, was the first to systematically explore. The Alice stories are modern psychological fairy tales, but also clever mock epics, like Pope's The Rape of the Lock. A 7-year-old girl is the intrepid protagonist, embarked on the archetypal journey of myth and legend that represents life itself. It is an inquisitiveness, a burning curiosity or thirst for knowledge that plummets Alice into her adventures in both books. Alone and lost, she shows courage and resourcefulness. Strange, menacing beings and disorienting alterations of space and time beset her, but she survives by her wits, reasoning her way through each problem, and struggling to maintain the imperial British code of good manners amid confusion and chaos. On her heroic quest, normally the province of male warriors, Alice is forever the outsider, the alien, rebuffed by hostile cliques and quarreling in-groups, from the mad tea party to the garden of live flowers. On her travels over the meadows and through the woods, Alice never turns into Huck Finn, a smudged vagabond scamp. She remains the well-bred young lady, her crisp apron and pinafore undisheveled even when she falls into a pool of tears, or rockets up and down, bizarrely changing size. After Bloomsbury, we have been too ready to see male oppression in the 19th century. Alice's resilient femininity shows the power of Victorian womanhood. Rarely fearful and never frail or hysterical, Alice reflects Carroll's real-life adulation of little girls as superior to boys, whom he loathed and avoided. The circumstances surrounding the composition of the Alice books would, in today's climate of sexual suspicion, get the author into very hot water indeed. On July 4, 1862, 2 bachelor clergymen, Carroll and Robinson Duckworth, took the 3 little sisters on one of many private boating parties on the Thames, which at various times ended in the group hiding from the summer sun under a hay rick, or getting soaked to the skin from a thunderstorm. On this particular day, Carroll, entertaining the children with his usual extemporaneous tales and riddles, created a fantasy starring his special favorite Alice, which was so mesmerizing that she pleaded for him to write it down. The first manuscript was called Alice's Adventures Underground. A lifelong celibate, Carroll had no known romances with adults. Quiet, awkward, and introverted, he was afflicted with a bad stammer that disappeared only in the company of children, whom he loved to entertain. While traveling, he carried a black bag of games, tricks, and puzzles to pique the attention of little girls. Carroll's intentions were probably not overtly physical, like those of Humbert Humbert in Nabokov's Lolita, but perhaps it is naive to deny there was an element of sublimated, voyeuristic eroticism in his attraction to girls, with whom he may have secretly identified. As an amateur portrait photographer of considerable distinction, Carroll took a series of nude or semi-nude pictures of girls, many of which were later destroyed at his instructions. It appears that Mrs. Liddell, the dean's wife, disliked Carroll's loitering persistence, though he was tolerated as a harmless, if tiresome, eccentric. Games the little sisters were learning, first croquet, then chess, shape the two books. Carroll's vivid characters are often game pieces come to life. The furious, stentorian Queen of Hearts and her playing card children, trembling gardeners and loyal soldiers, who bend double to serve as croquet arches. Or the pursed, dictatorial Red Queen and kindly, untidy White Queen, whom Alice, in her female rites of passage, encounters on the testing ground of a vast geographical chessboard. Game motifs are also present in Dodo Bird's tumultuous, circular caucus race, and in the fierce ritual combats of Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the Lion and Unicorn, and the Red Knight and Maladroit White Knight. We know that Carroll, a workaholic, obsessive-compulsive organizer and chronic insomniac, used puzzles, math problems, and quirky mental inventions to get himself through the night and to drive away irreverent or impure thoughts. He was an early speculator in symbolic logic. One of his academic books is called The Game of Logic. But beyond this, Carroll sees all of life as a game, whose rules we must learn by comic trial and error. Despite our best intentions, reality often proves refractory or rebellious, as when Alice, earnestly trying to play croquet, finds her mallet, a live flamingo, twisting itself upwards to stare her in the face. Many Freudian interpretations of the Alice books treat them in distressingly reductive terms, as neurotic manifestations of a social misfit. But it is equally possible to see Carroll's maimed isolation and detachment as the inspiration for his coolly scientific view of society, as a web work of conventions. The best examples are his tea party and courtroom scenes, with their elaborate ceremonial formalism. Critics have rightly noted Carroll's prefiguration of Kafka's The Trial and The Castle, modernist portrayals of amoral, arbitrary authority. There are analogies to the then-developing discipline of anthropology. Alice visits culture after culture, meeting their despotic rulers, learning their foods, customs, and languages, and inadvertently violating their surprise taboos. For instance, she finds herself in a Cyclops-like cave, the dusky shop of the curt, taciturn knitting sheep, with its porous shelving and uncooperative floating curios and magic transformation into a stream lined with scented rushes. There may be also influences from Darwin's natural history. Alice confronts a host of familiar and exotic animals, insects, and plants, who deem themselves quite equal and even superior to mere humans. Each being has its own story, poem, or song, lengthy spiritual autobiographies or genealogies, which Alice listens to with polite patience that wears thin as the day goes on. Carroll's anthropomorphism is never coy or sentimental, in the standard Victorian way. The Alice books have the uncanny animism of primitive religions. These daunting creatures are bold, brash, and sharp-tongued. Even a pudding comes alive and indignantly berates Alice. What impertinence for cutting a slice of it! Tooth and claw Darwinian themes of violence and carnivorousness abound. Alice is always catching herself as she carelessly, or as Freud would say, perversely, mentions a predator, cats, humans, to its prey, mice, birds, fish, and she herself has a quite unwordsworthian spirit of sadistic mischief, as when she frightens her old nurse by shouting in her ear, "Nurse, do let's pretend that I'm a hungry hyena and you're a bone." Carol systematically subverts Victorian moralism by making didactism synonymous with humorlessness and sterility. The aggressive voices of Carol's characters are unique and unforgettable. As in the great tradition of British drama, Carol's childhood love of the theatre was squelched by his clergyman father. Personality is created by the power of language. Animals or objects burst into speech and hector Alice, who holds her own in scuffling fencing matches of prickly dialogue. Carol's meditations on language anticipate 20th century literary theory. Both the Gnat and Humpty Dumpty speculate about the relativity of names, and the Cheshire Cat makes a philosophical argument for radical subjectivity in our perceptions of the world. The ersatz Anglo-Saxon poem Jabberwocky uses punning portmanteau words simultaneously to intensify meaning and to break it down into Carolian nonsense or absurdity. There is a persistent oscillation between language and silence, as the seething, quarrelsome characters suddenly stop and stare at each other, mute and stunned. The dramatic panache of the Alice books was appreciated early on. A stage version of Alice in Wonderland appeared in London in 1886, while Carol was still alive. There have been 3 movies, released in 1933, 1950, and 1972, and an animated Walt Disney musical version, 1951. However, the most indelible images remain those created by Sir John Tenniel, a brilliant illustrator who labored under Carol's vexingly punctilious supervision. The Tenniel Alice with long blonde tresses was based on another Carol intimate, Mary Badcock, rather than slim, dark-haired Alice Liddell, whose connection to the first book was prudently obscured. But it is surely Alice Liddell's personality that draws us in and charms us. "Who am I?" Carol's Alice asks, like Odysseus, Oedipus, and Hamlet, as she makes her way past the Elysian throngs of bores, and bullies, the meddlers, dandies, raconteurs, monomaniacs, melancholics, tricksters, sophists, gurus, gluttons, loafers, ninnies, male bunglers, and female termagants. The Alice books are a Saturnalian dream within a dream, a sequence of surreal cinematic episodes linked by the melting transitions and misty amnesia of our innermost stream of consciousness. "I've got a right to think," Alice defiantly declares to the ugly Duchess. In Carol's Panorama of the Mind, where romantic imagination and enlightenment intellect join, Alice is our proxy in stubbornly making sense out of the flux of time. Thank you for listening. Like, comment, subscribe, and have a blessed day.